Hi, everybody. I'm Freya Hartzell, Assistant Professor of the History of Modern Design, Architecture, and Art at Bard Graduate Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Professor Deborah Ascher Barnstone. Deborah Barnstone is Professor of Architecture and Head of the School of Architecture at University of Technology, Sydney. She is not only an architectural historian, but also a practicing licensed architect as well. She holds degrees from Barnard College, Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and Delft University of Technology. Professor Barnstone's innovative work on the relationships among art, architecture, and culture during the modern period has proved formative for the study of modernism more broadly, and has also been important to my own work in this field. She's the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and books, including The Break with the Past, German Avant-Garde Architecture 1910 to 1925, published by Routledge in 2018, Beyond the Bauhaus, Cultural Modernity in Weimar Breslau, 1918 to 1933, by University of Michigan Press in 2016, and her most recent monograph, which I think we'll hear more about in just a moment, The Color of Modernism, Paints, Pigments, and the Transformation of Modern Architecture in 1920s Germany, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2021. I've also had the very good fortune to participate in this volume. I have show and tell for you today, Material Modernity, Innovations in Art, Design, and Architecture in the Weimar Republic, which Professor Barnstone edited along with our friend and colleague Maria McKella, and which is hot off Bloomsbury's presses just this month. Just a couple of words about how today's event will run. Professor Barnstone will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open things up for questions and discussion. For the question and answer session, please use the Q&A function. We have a number of colleagues joining us as panelists. So for the panelists, please use the raise hand function, and I will call on you to unmute and ask your question. We also have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC option at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm going to turn things over to our speaker. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Freya. Hello, and thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I were not virtual, since I'm actually sitting in a hotel room in New York City, but there we go. I'm going to speak from my new book, as Freya mentioned, The Color of Modernism, which was just released. I've excerpted material, which means that I'm going to skim over the topics without delving into too much detail. So please feel free to ask questions at the end and slow me down in the middle if I'm going too quickly. One of the most enduring and pervasive myths about early modern architecture is that it was white. And yet nothing could be further from the truth. A fascinating aspect of architecture in the early modern period is the variety of color theories that architects were engaged with and the ways that color was used. Architects developed theoretical approaches to color application on the exterior and interior of buildings based on color theory in art and science. The importance of color in architecture during the 1920s has been largely overlooked for several reasons. The theoretical positioning of early modernism in the beginning of the 20th century, the ways in which early modernism's history was initially written, coupled with unease and doubt about color, and the lack of any systematic study of color theory in the arts or architecture before John Gage's groundbreaking books, Color and Meaning, Art, Science, and Symbolism, and Color and Culture, Practice and Meaning from Antiquity to Abstraction in 1999 and 2000, many years after the early modern period. Early historians of the German Neues Bauen, the German name for early modernism, often emphasize the supposed formal and aesthetic purity of the new rational approach to design over a more complex and nuanced interpretation. And black and white photography, like the images pictured here, disguise the truth about these projects, since color reads as gray or black in photos. In addition, in Germany, proximity to the 19th century polychrome debates made use of color suspect for many, and it didn't help things that the great advocate for color use, Bruno Taut, was an eccentric and somewhat marginalized architect. Color theory is as old as humankind The ancient Greek philosophers developed theories of color, as did every successive generation of philosophers, scientists, and artists. One of the many challenges in studying this field, therefore, is the proliferation of theories and their differences. A central question for color theorists from the beginning has been what constitute the basic or primary colors. This is particularly interesting for artists who work with color to create visual effects by mixing. They need to know which colors can be used to create other colors. A related and equally long-standing strand of color theory is the color system, a logical sequence in which to arrange hues. You see some of the many ideas pictured here. From the time of Isaac Newton's groundbreaking work on the composition of light in the 17th century, the spectral order of the rainbow has been the most common starting point for such systems. But there's no consensus on what colors in that spectrum are, how many there are, Newton himself vacillated on this question, or even in what order they should appear. A new modern interest in color dates to a book by German philosopher Johann von Goethe, published in 1810, entitled Theory of Colors. Goethe challenged Newton's theory. Newton had passed white light through a prism and discovered the constituents colors, like in the image you're looking at now. Newton therefore thought that color was a physical problem related to light on objects. In contrast, Goethe believed that color must be understood as a perceptual phenomenon, since it is comprehended via sight. In his view, Newton erred by ignoring vision, the optical responses to stimuli that allow color perception, to focus only on the mechanics of color, the way color acts as an attribute of light. For 100 years after Goethe, philosophers, scientists, psychologists, and artists researched color to try to comprehend it. By the 1920s, they developed a series of different understandings of what color is, how it's perceived, and how it acts on the human psyche. Color is a physical, physiological, and perceptual phenomenon, which is why experts in such diverse fields have researched it. It's the product of a physiological response to external stimuli and the result of perceptual experience. All three aspects of color are important to architectural design and were explored in the 1920s. Often working closely with contemporary artists, architects in the period developed an astonishing breadth of approaches that ranged from using color as surface ornament, to color as space-making element, to color as the agent of emotional charge, to color as the quality that could illusionistically dissolve the surface of a wall to transform physical enclosure and architecture into dematerialized abstract entities. Thus, color was integral to the spatial quality of design, not applied as an afterthought, and it was a key aspect to the work of many architects developing new aesthetic systems. During my research, I was able to identify 5 distinct approaches that architects in the 1920s took, which I will address briefly in what follows. All of these strategies are related and often overlap. The use of color in 1920s German architecture was intimately tied to mysticism, esotericism, and the occult, especially aspects of Annie Besant's and C.W. Ledbetter's interpretation of theosophy and Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. The general turn towards mysticism and spiritism in European society was in part a reaction against a world that at the end of the 19th century seemed mired in rationalism and materialism to the exclusion of higher non-physical concerns. The Industrial Revolution that accelerated in Germany after unification in 1871 seemed to represent the triumph of science and technology over religion, faith, and spirituality. The new search for spiritual meaning was also spurred by the sense that many German intellectuals shared that cultural renewal was both necessary and imminent. If mysticism and the occult seem the very opposite of scientific study today, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the divisions between the two were blurred. This was a time when researchers attempted to come to terms with the unseen world that new technologies like the X-ray, electromagnetic waves, and the telegraph increasingly revealed. If matter consisted of particles too small for the naked eye to perceive, but perceptible with a microscope, who was to say that the human spirit could not be made visible using the correct instrument? If new technologies could capture invisible particles like atoms, why couldn't they capture the human soul or thought? Some actually attempted to do so, like Hippolyte Baraduc, to photograph the soul leaving the body and human thoughts in the brain. It turns out that what he captured on his film, and pictured here, was heat in the exposure of the film, not the soul or thoughts, but his experiments were in keeping with a logic that appealed to many at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. The scientific interest in spiritual questions was not the sole preserve of quacks and mediums, but pillars of society and serious intellectuals were equally taken up with them. In England, for example, the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, included amongst its members such luminaries as Doyle and former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour. And I should also add that mysticism offered an antidote to the devastation of World War I and all the human losses. Already in the 18th century, the German physician Franz Anton Mesmer had theorized the existence of an invisible energetic force, a magnetic fluid in all people that was subject to the same gravitational pull as planets. He called the force animal magnetism, then later renamed it mesmerism. He was convinced that disease was caused by blocked flows of this magnetic fluid. If the fluid could be manipulated to flow again and achieve harmony in the body, then the patient would be healed. He therefore developed a series of treatments to improve fluid flow using magnetic wand, other devices, and suggestive therapy that was a precursor to modern-day hypnosis. From this idea of invisible forces pulsing through us or around us, it was a short leap to the idea of human aura, something both theosophists and anthroposophists would embrace. They believe that every human has an aura comprised of color that is only visible to people with the perceptual ability to see it, clairvoyance. The colors have meaning. They describe the person's essence and emotional state, as outlined in the chart here. Anthroposophists also believe that the world in which we exist is a sea of color that we swim through, and that human thought and emotion also have color. Besant and Ledbetter illustrated human thoughts with colorful diagrams like these pictured here. Former theosophist and founder of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, went even further. He credited artists with the special ability to use color to visualize the invisible in the world. He believed that architecture, together with color, sat at the juncture between the spirit world and the physical world, and therefore were the vehicles through which people could be taught to see the invisible world of souls, auras, and thought. He developed a theory of color to govern its application in anthroposophical architecture, color application that would facilitate access to the spirit world. Steiner designed and constructed 2 buildings in Dornach, Switzerland, where he tested his ideas. This is the first building, which burned down in 1923, just before it was completed. Although the building is long gone, the images we have of the frescoes and their color scheme tell a lot about what Steiner was trying to achieve. He had the interiors painted in the primary colors. He insisted on using natural plant-based pigments in a transparent wash because he thought that this facilitated the ability to see through the physical to the spirit world beyond. And the swirls of color that you see here interacted with figurative representational images to emulate the sea of color in which anthroposophists believe we live. Another concept that dates to the end of the 19th century and that intersected with color theory and new spatial schemas was the notion of a fourth dimension of space. For over 2,000 years, there was only one form of geometry, that of Euclid, which was based on a system of axioms and theorems derived from those axioms. The system was believed to objectively describe physical reality and space. After all, geometry means to measure the earth. At the beginning of the 19th century, three mathematicians, German Johann Carl Friedrich Gauss, Hungarian János Bolyai, and Russian Nikolai Lobachevsky, independently challenged the Euclidean system by interrogating the validity of his fifth axiom, the parallel postulate, which you might remember from high school. It reads, in a plane, given a line and a point not on it, at most one line parallel to the given line can be drawn through the point. And that's pictured in image 1 on the screen, figure 1. All three men discovered consistent non-Euclidean geometries in which the parallel postulate did not hold, opening the path for other dimensional spatial models and undermining the absolute correlation of mathematics with perceptible reality. And figures 2 and 3 show this. Concave and convex or curved surfaces are ones in which the parallel postulate does not hold true. What their work suggested is that there were spatial dimensions beyond the three commonly understood, and that they might be beyond normal human perception. Stated otherwise, the advent of non-Euclidean geometry challenged not only mathematics, but ideas as to the very nature of space itself, how it is perceived, and how it is measured. The new math proposed spatial dimensions imperceptible to the naked eye, but mathematically valid nonetheless. These are diagrams by British mathematician and science fiction writer Charles Hinton that illustrate the new spatial thinking. Pull a point along one dimension and you get a plane. Pull a line along one dimension and you get a line. Pull a line along one dimension and you get a plane. Extrude the plane and you get a cube. You're now in 3 dimensions. Extrude the cube and you get a figure in 4 dimensions that he named the tesseract. Hinton used color in his book, The Fourth Dimension, to visualize the tesseract, which is the first instance of color and this kind of space being tied to one another. Architects were fascinated with the new geometries and their implications for architectural design. In the Netherlands, the De Stijl group, led by Theo van Doesburg, believed that they could design a new kind of space inspired by the tesseract and fourth dimensional thinking. These are 2 experiments in which van Doesburg and van Esteren probe open spatial planning based on the tesseract form, using overlapping and intersecting planes with primary colors. In architectural terms, the challenge was how to make the invisible fourth dimension perceptible. That is, how to explore the new spatial idea with the very material means of architecture. Architects therefore began to combine new spatial models like open plan, open section, and axonometric with applications of color that articulated enclosure in new and unfamiliar ways. The results were immersive color spaces that used the combination of color with geometric form, often on all 6 sides of the room, floor, ceiling, and walls, to obliterate familiar spatial markers. Pure color combined with abstraction was one means with which to achieve spiritual expression in architecture, as well as to disintegrate the materiality of the architecture in order to reconstruct it as a temporal experience. A group of artists and architects in Germany, including Hermann Finsterlin, Paul Gesch, Wenzel Hablich, and Bruno Tau with Karl Krail and Franz Mutzenbecher produced some of the most unusual and original colored spaces of the 1920s. Hobblick's experiments were among the most innovative. He applied his color and formal philosophies to both painting and interior architecture, two art forms that he believed were intertwined and for which he designed and executed some of the most daring interiors proposed or built by anyone in Germany in the period. His interior designs included his own home, homes for private clients, a restaurant, hotel, store, and exhibition spaces. One of the boldest propositions Hobblick executed was for the dining room in his own home, shown here as it is today. Completed in 1923, the room is covered with alternating bands of vibrant hues, interspersed with geometric shapes that recall many of his paintings. And I'm sorry, I'm not showing you any of the paintings, just the architecture. Hobblick's palette includes a range of primary and secondary colors, such as red, yellow, blue, green, violet, and orange. He also liberally uses the peach color favored by Rudolf Steiner. Hobblick applies color to obliterate many conventional architectural markers, such as moldings, door panels, and corners between surfaces, by simply painting his patterns as if these elements didn't exist. Colored stripes and rectangles fold around corners, extend beyond frames, and overlap different adjacent surfaces so that the colored patterns, not the architecture, are the dominant feature. This helps create the illusion of entering a new kind of space. There's no discernible compositional logic to the painting either. In some places, Hobblick suddenly varies the scale of colored elements to form a mini composition within the greater whole, so that they represent a canvas hung on the wall or a miniature world within the larger one surrounding it. In other places, as above the heater shown here, he totally changes the color palette and patterns. The fact that individual walls and ceiling are treated equally without hierarchy means that any surface might be interchanged with any other. Usual spatial markers like up and down are eliminated. Looking straight ahead or upwards in the room conveys the sense of standing in a gravity-free space or an alternate dimension. Unfortunately, as you can see in the slides, Hobblick didn't paint the floors and used conventional furniture in the room, which disrupt the illusion that he was trying to create. There is no denying that we can see neither color without space nor space without color, begins Carl Buehler's 1922 book on color psychology, The Appearances of Colors. Buehler's observations were well known to artists and in the 1920s, architects who experimented with ways of using color to alter spatial perception. Three approaches to the understanding of the character of space, as posited by Newton, Leibniz, and Kant, underpin later debates about the nature of spatial perception. They comprise space as an independent entity, as a relation, or as a transcendental ideal. And I'll explain what that means. The human relationship to space and the way space is perceived differs radically among these conceptions. Newton, who believed that space was a distinct entity, neither belonging to the human body nor to objects, distinguished between absolute space, which is immeasurable and imperceptible, yet contains all the beings and objects in the world, and relative space, quote, which our senses determine by its relation to bodies, end quote. While absolute space is immeasurable, relative space is defined by reference to the bodies in it and can be mathematically measured. Leibniz, in contrast, held that space only existed as the relative location of objects. Space was either the relations between actual objects or relations between places that those objects might occupy, but notably not a thing in itself. Kant espoused yet another viewpoint. If space is ideal, as Kant maintained, then it exists a priori in each person. Kant explains, quote, space isn't something objective and real, nor a substance, nor an accident, nor a relation. Instead, it is subjective and ideal, and originates from the mind's nature in accord with a stable law as a scheme, as it were, for coordinating everything sensed externally, end quote. Space for Kant, then, is merely a perceptual framework imposed on the world so that it can be understood. Kant's theory was viewed by many physiologists and psychologists in the 1920s as a foundational statement on spatial perception. So we perceive space using a framework. In the traditional sense separation of pictorial representation into two constituent parts, lines and colors, or disegno and colorito, lie two different ways of creating spatial illusion on the flat picture plane, through the converging lines of perspectival drawing and through contrast expressed with color and light. The polarity between disegno and colorito was more than a subject of debate over the correct or better way to portray the visual world. It was an expression of a deeper, long-standing controversy over how humans perceive that world. In a colored world, the way that color acts on spatial perception is critical. In France, Robert Delaunay and his wife Sophie were two of the first painters to use color as the sole means of representation. It's the value of individual hues, their relative brightness, and the juxtaposition of those hues on the picture plane that creates the impression of space without recourse to recognizable form or traditional perspective or linear delineation. One of the most interesting collaborations on color and spatial perception was between Hinrich Schepper and Walter Gropius, and their masterpiece was this well-known building, I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Dessau Bauhaus. Gropius and Schepper believed that color is one of the essential elements of space and therefore architecture. Through color, together with the other basic elements, shape and tone, space is experienced and understood. They were interested in the illusory potential of color, its ability to change our perception of space. They probed ways of making a stationary object, architecture, appear to move by repeating colored elements. They used color to control what the eye focused on in individual spaces. They used color to alter the sense of depth in a room, to frame important details, and to create spatial illusions. Schepper developed a detailed colored plan for the exterior and interiors. His approach demonstrated a rich understanding of the possibilities of color application from a material, scientific, and psychological point of view, ideas that were deeply influenced by the color theories taught at the Bauhaus. Having been involved in the wall painting workshop during Ittens, Schlemmer's, and Kandinsky's tenures, Schepper learned about color from each of these masters. Schepper's palette at the Bauhaus included white, gray, and black, together with the primary hues red, yellow, and blue. This stairwell is typical. It juxtaposes bright yellow stripes on the undersides of the beams with red banister walls and a blue end wall. The yellow and red lines gesture towards the stair landing and the large window. The yellow painted beams terminate in a dark gray beam whose color wraps down the walls on either side of the stairwell to frame it and to emphasize the threshold between stair and corridor. The total effect, as the eye moves over yellow, red, and blue surfaces, is one of swirling motion. By only painting the beam's undersides and leaving the sides white, Schepper reduced the three-dimensionality of the structure to a line that seems to float in space, a technique he uses on multiple surfaces. In 1919, Bruno Taut, decrying gray cities and dull colorless places, called for the restoration of optical pleasure in architecture. While he certainly used hyperbole to make his point, Taut recognized how integral color is to human happiness. The colors of the physical world do more than enhance three-dimensional spatial vision. They enliven the environment and can bring real joy. Think of the way that the sight of a stunning flower, a double rainbow, or a magnificent sunset can lift the spirits. Goethe expressed this well, quote, "People generally enjoy color. The eye, like light, needs it. Remember the reinvigoration when, on a cloudy day, the sun shines on a single part of the area and the colors are visible there," end quote. In other words, color brings delight to all aspects of life. There is a long-standing tradition of using color on the exteriors of German vernacular architecture, dating back at least to the Middle Ages. It was usual to mix color in the stucco used on facades of half-timbered houses, and in some places, to color the timbers brightly. It was also common practice in many parts of the country to apply vivid color to wooden shutters, window frames, architectural details, and ornament. Such treatments were equally the norm in the cities as in villages, although by the 18th century, as buildings were increasingly constructed of stone or brick made to appear like stone, color fell out of fashion. By 1900, a group of German architects had begun to lobby their colleagues for a return to color in the urban realm. And Taut picked this up in the 1920s. Convinced that transforming cities into colorful streetscapes could improve the public's sense of well-being, Taut embarked on an ambitious campaign to paint the city of Magdeburg in bright colors. Between 1922 and 1924, he successfully repainted City Hall, had colored 11 buildings along a kilometer-long stretch of Otto Richter Straße in the city center, and another 69 buildings in other parts of the city. Taut collaborated with a team for the project that included Karl Krail, Johannes Göderitz, Erich Weishaupt, and Konrad Rühl. Taut and his team worked with highly saturated, brilliant primary hues, which in the main were cobalt blue, canary yellow, deep cadmium red, and cyan. These enhance the architectural elements and use color contrast, color harmony, and the interaction of color and light to create visual effects. And you see that he used quite a bit of pattern as well. Taut was able to give the visual harmony to the whole by using a consistent palette for the entire kilometer-long painted area, just alternating the parts of the building on which he used each of the colors. And each of the principal colors appears on every facade in one way or another. So now to the last section of the talk. For anthroposophists and theosophists, color was a manifestation of human aura and emotional states, as well as a bridge to the invisible spiritual world. For others, colored light and colored space had curative properties, the ability to affect the human psyche and emotions. For a brief period in 1876 and 1877, Americans were seized with a craze for the color blue, especially blue light, and fervently purchased blue glass for their homes and eyeglasses, even blue wallpaper, in a quest to create spaces filled with blue color and light, driving the price of blue glass up by over 50%. The craze was spurred by the publication of a book by American Civil War General Augustus James Pleasanton, who claimed a raft of curative benefits derived from exposure to blue light. As strange as the blue glass craze may seem when looking back on it today, it's just one example of the centuries-old belief in chromotherapy, the power of color to heal illness by acting on the human psyche. Belief in the curative and effective powers of color has persisted for centuries, in spite of little supporting scientific proof. Only recently have scientists begun to uncover the actual benefits of color and colored light and to distinguish them from false claims. The raft of publications appearing every year on the emotional values of color, how color can influence responses to advertising, and how color can affect interior space, to name a few, are evidence of the enduring attraction of the idea that color has both positive and negative effects on the human psyche, on emotional well-being, and on physical health. In 1912, Vasily Kandinsky published On the Spiritual in Art, in which he described his ideas about the effective meaning or value of color. Kandinsky's ideas, in turn, were similar to those of Goethe and Schiller, who developed the wheel pictured here, although not identical. In the wheel, you can see how emotions like melancholy are associated with specific colors. One of the first color schemes for the interior of a Neues Bauen house was the axonometric drawing Benita Koch-Otte drew together with Georg Muche in 1923 for the Haus am Horn in Weimar. Koch-Otte's axonometric suggests an ambitious and comprehensive color scheme for the house in which each room is totally painted in a single primary or secondary color to create a three-dimensional color space. In the second half of the 1920s, Bruno Taut developed a new way of using color on the interior that was a radical departure from his previous color work. The change also signaled a shift in emphasis from color vision and color space approaches to color from the start of his practice. Taut's new strategy was to use colored walls to envelop the visitor in a single color environment, thereby creating the kind of immersive color space like that proposed by Koch-Otte for the Haus am Horn. When enveloped by a single color, the visitor is under its effective power. If, as Taut asserts, quote, art is the communication of sensations, end quote, then color is the perfect medium with which to communicate in architectural interiors, because its power can be deployed at every scale on any surface and object. To give a couple of examples, the living room is located at the back of the ground floor. Taut selected a light green for all the walls in this space, with the exception of a small yellow band underneath the window, which you can't see in the slides, I apologize. The old-fashioned oven is covered with a darker green tile. The floor is a brick red and the ceiling white, which has the effect of pulling your eye to the green or keeping your eye keeping your gaze at eye level, I should say. This is the space in which the family is supposed to find repose. Both Kandinsky and Goethe believed that absolute green was the most restful color in existence. When green is light and has more yellow in it, Kandinsky thought, as do the walls at the Hufeisensiedlung, he thought it represented the green of summer when growth slows and can be enjoyed, the perfect space for living. For the bedroom, Taut used an electric blue on the walls, which he complemented with a brick red heating element that matches the flooring. Kandinsky valued blue above all colors. He called blue heavenly and the color of repose, which makes it particularly well suited to a bedroom. The child's bedroom, in contrast, is painted bright yellow with a deep blue heating element and brick red on the floor and upholstery. Yellow is a warm and lively color when it's not sour, Kandinsky writes, and therefore appropriate for a child's space. The combination of red, yellow, and blue of a similar value makes the room visually lively and seems appropriate for an area in which someone is going to play. With incredible foresight, or perhaps mere serendipity, Bruno Taut published an essay titled Die Farbe, the color, in 1930 that summarized his view of the state of color use in German architectural practice as the decade closed. According to Taut, most architects, even those progressives who embrace the Neues Bauen tenets of functional, clean, white architecture, no longer regarded color suspiciously or as a romantic aberration. Whether or not that was entirely true in 1930, it's certainly true that 100 years after Taut's call for colorful buildings and the many experiments with ways of using color to improve architecture conducted in the 1920s, color continues to fascinate theorists, artists, architects, urban designers, physiologists, and psychologists in Germany and throughout the world. Although there is no evidence that colored space can transport people to other dimensions, numerous ideas with which Taut and his contemporaries experimented that were beyond the scope of 1920 science can now be tested, measured, and verified. This means that some hypotheses that seemed far-fetched 100 years ago have sometimes proven to be true. Scientists today have better instruments with which to measure the physiology of color vision and to study color psychology, and color vision can be measured with a variety of quite accurate tests that check the observer's ability to identify hue and brightness by matching, discerning, or arranging hues. While the question of color affect that fascinated Taut and his contemporaries has only received serious academic attention in recent years, here too advances continue to be made. And although color psychology is still an understudied field, as the tools of cognitive science have improved to allow for more accurate measurements of human responses to external stimuli, research in this area is slowly expanding. It seems that the color with which a space is rendered can indeed affect the people inside it. Research has also shown that modern colored light therapies can have positive curative effects for specific types of illness, such as neonatal jaundice and seasonal affective disorder. And a survey of contemporary practice worldwide reveals many architects experimenting with and working with color today, like this project from German architect Sauerbruch and Hutton, demonstrates the enduring appeal of color in architectural applications. Bruno Taut may not have lived to see the victory of color or even its true rebirth, but 100 years after his engagement with the problem of color, innovative use of color in architecture and urban design is still a mark of the avant-garde. Thank you.
Deborah, thank you for that talk. I'm just fascinated, and I have about 6 million questions, and I'll try to limit myself to 1 or 2.
Only 1 million.
I'll be looking you up later on. But yeah, this is such a wonderful project, and I have to say I'm a little bit jealous that it's not my project because it's just so interesting and touches on so many things that I'm working with and thinking about teaching too. I'm teaching a German design course in the fall, and a lot of this, I'm really happy to have this book in my hands to be able to use. But one thing that I'd like to just ask you a little bit about is Muncell, who's somebody that I've been interested in for a long time. And I guess one granular question, which is, do you have a theory about why he didn't paint the floors and why he did use traditional furniture? And I guess the tack on to that question is, did he design the tile stove? Because the grate on the tile stove looks very Hablich-y to me.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question in a couple of different ways. He must have known that was a problem, because in drawings for other projects, he did design the floor. So unfortunately, the dining room is one of the only ones that's still preserved, and it's just such an amazing space. I had to show it, but he must have known that was an issue. In one of the projects for the Sutia wallpaper company, one of the redesigns for them, he eventually treats all of the surfaces. A lot of the other interiors he does. So that's the answer to that. He also, for other projects, designed all of the furniture and all of the upholstery to fit in with the scheme. So I'm going to now speculate that, like most architects, he was probably stressed for time and also stressed. I know that he struggled financially. Almost every artist and architect does. And so he probably couldn't afford to do in his own home what he could afford to do for paid clients. And unfortunately, because this was such a short talk, I didn't show you slides of Carl Crail's projects. But Crail did a series of interiors where he covered everything, and they're wild. But unfortunately, in the case of Crail, I didn't show them because they didn't survive, and the only images are black and white. So we can only imagine what they look like. But he had covered every piece of furniture and every surface in the rooms.
Yeah, and this is such a, it's so useful and it's so interesting because, you know, as somebody who also works with either with interiors that no longer exist or we can only see in black and white photographs, I've struggled with this so much, how to portray these to an audience or to a readership, you know, in color. And so it's just very fascinating to see what you've done with this, but I'll stop talking. It looks like Catherine, you have your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Deborah, thank you so much. This is really exciting and interesting talk. And I have a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is give you an option of answering 1, 2, or 3.
Or all 3.
And can I also say that how much I know when our other colleagues do this, I think, what? Can't they just make up their mind? But I'm just going to go with it. So the first one is about this kind of question of historiography and retrospection. And so why, can you talk more about why we think of this architecture and design and interiors as white or black and white monochromatic? That's one question.
Yep.
The second question is about the Oswald and Muncell color systems, and your thoughts about those. And also this, you were talking about color psychology. So the relationship of human factors design into this question of color psychology. And I'm going to do some disclosure here on this second and third question, which is that I was trained as a designer in the 1980s. And I learned the Oswald system, I learned the Muncell system, and I learned human factors. And I also learned some like basic Bauhaus 3D, 2D design. So it was really interesting for me hearing you and just reflecting on that and what I learned and didn't learn at that time. So any of those, because I know there's time is short and other people want to ask questions.
I'm going to start with the first one because one of my professors and also someone else who he's married to are two of the people responsible for making me become interested in this topic because in fact I start the book with the story about one of them who gave a lecture with in front of 3,000 people in Sydney, Australia about 4 years ago with a giant image of do you know the Paimeo Sanatorium by
Yeah.
Okay.
Alto.
Alto, yep. Showing the interior in color. And she said to the audience, and of course, early modernism was totally white. And behind her is an image that is yellow, blue, and red, and white. And I thought, And it turns out her partner wrote a very well-known history of the period, all about how white the architecture was. And why has the history been written that way? It's complicated, of course. One has to do with the way that the first generation of historians, like Siegfried Gideon, who were very deeply implicated in the movement themselves, they weren't distant. They were part of the early modern movement, wanted to portray things, and they wanted an image of health and hygiene and whiteness and cleanliness, and color was, didn't quite fit that image of what the architecture of the period looked like. And of course, they were aided and abetted by black and white photography, which doesn't show the colors. So it made it a lot easier to say, this is what everything looked like. And by the way, of course, they weren't wrong. White was very much a part of the aesthetic of the period. It's just that things were much more complicated than that. The other thing I think I mentioned really quickly in the beginning of the introduction was the polychrome debates of the 19th century. You know, for a very long time, I don't know how much the students would know this, there was this myth that ancient Greek and Roman architecture was white because of how things had aged over time. And with the advent of modern archaeology, people began to discover, much to their surprise and dismay, that actually the ancients had painted you know, the architecture that looked white because the color had all peeled off or disintegrated over time. And so there are huge debates over whether the painting really, whether what archaeologists discovered was really true. How does this relate to how we design now? And you have a sense amongst many in Germany that whiteness somehow is pure, clean, unadulterated, and color is something that people who are uncultivated and unsophisticated use. So this is another reason why the color is suppressed. It's interesting, even Le Corbusier, for example, you know, one of the great architects of the period, used color liberally and extensively and was a real pioneer in color use. So it's not just the Germans who are playing with it. So does that answer enough why white could be a lecture on its own?
Do you think
No,
that
that's perfect.
there's something about wanting to suppress a sense of irrationalism? I mean, you know, with Taut and the Habliks, and you know, I think too that writing out the expressionism or the irrational or whatever else, the spiritualism.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and we know. I mean, this is you will all know this. Just in the last maybe decade, many of us are looking at what was going on with spiritism, the occult, the esoteric, you know, Libiato. You know, is where it comes to mind, for example, because that was suppressed by the first generation of histories too, for a whole host of reasons. It's very uncomfortable. How do you relate to this stuff? Is really weird. I had, when I lectured on this a few years ago, I had a student who raised his hand, first year architecture student. His eyes were really wide. I said, that was so interesting. Did it work? You know, what he meant was, did they dissolve the space? Could you enter the fourth dimension? You know, it's pretty bizarre stuff. I don't know if I should go on to your other questions or give others a chance to ask.
I know that Ivan has to leave pünktlich at 1:15, so maybe we should let Ivan ask his question since he's going to spirit himself away.
Thanks very much, Freya. I just to explain to Deborah, I have to go to teach. So thanks so much for this. I should just admit that I'm colorblind to begin with. Red, green, anomalous. So I have problems there. But John Gage, whom you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned John. He was a very close friend, and so I learned quite a lot from him about color. What I wanted to ask you about was, having recently seen the drawing by Piet Mondrian for the Salon of Ida Binat that was in an exhibition at the Morgan Library just recently, it brought to mind the conflicts between Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg, and Mondrian's sort of split from De Stijl. And I was wondering, first thing was, is there anything in their respective uses of color in architectural planning and architecture, as planning only in the case of Mondrian? Is there anything there that a contrast between Mondrian's use and van Doesburg's use? That's the first thing. And the second is, and you may not want to go there because you didn't mention him, but I was thinking of weird spaces and color in weird spaces made by artists during this interwar period. So of course, Kurt Schwitter's Märzbau comes to mind. And I'm just wondering if you had any reflections on the Märzbau. I know we only know it from photographs and reconstructions, but but he did use color, I believe.
Interesting that you've mentioned something I edited out of the talk when I savagely cut it to fit into 40 minutes. We don't know we don't, of course, know, as you said, what the Merzbow looked like precisely. And what's interesting to me about it is that it looks very much like an earlier project that Bruno Taut, Mutzenbecher, and was it Krehl who was the third? There was a group of 3 or 4 of them who collaborated on a restaurant that doesn't exist anymore. That looks very much like a prototype for the Merzbow, as it had, you can see in the black and white photographs that it had very strange sort of sculptural things, 3-dimensional things going on, and then a riot of color and pattern. But beyond that, very difficult to understand what they've done. And what I don't understand is why the color camera existed in this period, and yet no one was using it. And I don't know why. So that's something that I need to research. I
think that color photography was really unstable at that point. But that's a really good question.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I asked Andres Zervigon, who knows much more about photographs and photography than I do, and he wasn't sure either. Anyway, so I don't know what the Merzbow looked like exactly. It was a little bit later than some of these, but he would have known all of these people, and they were all part of the same circle. Mondrian and Van Doesburg, interestingly, Mondrian actually did create his own studio and painted it in primary colors. And whilst the 2 of them had, as you said, they had an ideological break, if you look at the way that they used color and geometry on interior spaces, very similar in a lot of ways. So I'm not an expert on the De Stijl members, so I can't really speculate on what was going on, but I can tell you that their use, the Aubec Cafe by Van Doesburg and Mondrian's studio, I'm sorry, I don't have the images to show you right now, very similar. So my guess is that the break had more to do with personal conflict than ideological differences. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave.
Thanks, Ivan.
Yeah.
Lauren, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Deborah. What an incredible talk and subject matter. And I think I could probably talk to you about Wenzel's Hablig's house for way longer than we have time to discuss. But one thing that I recognized when you showed images of his house is that it looks pretty heavily restored. Mm-hmm. And much of the pigments that or the interiors that you were showing seem to have a very kind of synthetic quality to them, like the paint being used, especially during that time, would have been sort of newly manufactured, created. And Catherine, I'm glad that you mentioned Muncell. That's still how architectural conservators tend to match paint today, but they're kind of like in a synthetic realm that I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how these colors, especially manufactured and synthetic colors, were seen in relationship to other uses of color that may have been deemed decadent or other. Particularly, I'm thinking of kind of crude examples or ways in which German theorists would have looked down upon maybe other cultural applications of color. How is synthesizing color in this way deliberate in these spaces? If you could talk about that a little bit.
I'm not sure that I'm going to answer your question the way that you want me to.
Sure.
But thank you for mentioning synthetic color, because as you will know, this is a period in which there's an explosion of new manufacturers making colors and new color. Muncell system was one. There were several in Germany. Bruno Taut actually collaborated with a fabricator, and those colors that I showed you in that chart were colors that he developed based on the primaries that he thought were the correct colors to use. And he didn't leave enough behind for me to explain why they looked the way that they did. It's one of the great mysteries to live with. But For sure, the use of so much color had something to do with the new availability of all of these synthetic colors. And artists were fascinated with that. And obviously some of the architects were as well. What was the other part of your question?
I was wondering how this related to like improper uses of color, what it was in conversation with.
Well, I mean, certainly one of the reasons for whiteness would be Adolf Loos's famous disparaging of tattoos and color. So there's certainly a segment of the art and architectural community that will think of color as being crude and primitive, and therefore something you shouldn't use. But someone like Bruno Taub was fascinated by other cultures and talks about, how the Thai culture was filled with color and how beautiful that is, and something that, Germans could really learn from. So there isn't one attitude. It depends on who you're reading and who you're looking at. You have multiple attitudes simultaneously. There's a question in the chat.
There is, and I'm supposed to read it.
Okay.
So I'm going to read it. The question in the chat is, thanks for such an interesting talk. I was wondering if you could comment on the influence of these theories in interior decoration and the collecting of the decorative arts.
Oh, that's a great question, and goes way beyond my area of knowledge, to be honest. I am an expert on architects, but not on interior architecture or interior decoration. I can speculate. People like Wenzel Hablick was very much an interior decorator. As I said, he used fabric patterns. You'll know that the people working in the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus, for example, who were schooled in color theory, also engaged in designing, fabricating new patterns and new materials for interior decoration, interior use. But how widely, certainly the Bauhaus practitioners probably had more of an influence on what's happening than someone like Hablick, who was quite marginal. That's about as much as I can answer. Possibly Catherine could answer this better than I could.
Me.
I would love to have a further conversation about this. And I know Lauren and Freya and probably others would too. But it's just really, really interesting to hear about this. And also to think about how, retrospectively, what has become canonical or held on to and what's been erased. I think that's such an important component of your work, and I'm really grateful.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. Well, it's not interesting to cover ground that people have already covered.
Certainly not. I mean, I think also from some of the photographs, for instance, the photographs of Kandinsky's Bauhaus interiors, this element of the vernacular is also a part of this that you brought up, Deborah. And the really interesting one, right? Those Fachwerk houses, the half-timbered houses, that's really a thread. And I think, for somebody like Kandinsky, he was so interested in Russian vernacular culture in lots of different ways. But it's really interesting to look at some of those photographs of his Bauhaus house and see, these little objects and things that he was collecting, and how, in a way, seamlessly that blended with these big fields of color. And so I think it's also, another thread of this, right, is the kind of eclecticism that was also going on, and that we don't have in that more familiar narrative of modernism. And even the tile stoves, right, that all these tile stoves were being used, and they have such a connection to the Middle Ages, basically. That they've German tile stoves have been going forever. To see those kind of cubified, primary colored tile stoves in these interiors is really fun.
Those were, as far as I know, those were like the heating elements and other things not designed by anybody. Those were the things that were on the market, and then architects used them, ordered them in colors that fit their ideas for what the interior should look like, or, you know, in the Bauhaus did funny things like take the radiators and hang them up on the wall, you know, up 1.5 meters, turning the radiator into a work of art as a way of sort of changing your relationship to this familiar thing and modernizing it without changing it. So there's a lot of that going on. I think Kandinsky is really important to answer Lauren's question. You know, there's another aspect of artists looking at folk art and being inspired by it. Some were, some weren't. You know, I think the problem with the problem with a lot of the histories is that we've made them too reductive and too simple. So
I think that's a good place to end. But thank you again so much. This is really fascinating, and thank you, panelists. It's great questions. So we hope to see everybody at our next event. You can check our website for information. But Deborah, thank you again for such an inspiring talk. We're so glad you could join us.
well, thank you.
Next time in person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.